everybody. Welcome back to the Grazy podcast. This is Grace.
And Emma.
So today we're going to be talking about inner child healing. I know we hear that a lot throughout social media. So we have a special guest, Youme. She is a crazy boss, CEO slash influencer. Well, you introduce yourself.
Hello, well, thanks for having me, guys. My name is Youme Lin. I am the founder of Cloud Studio. We are a creative marketing agency based in New York, and I also do content creation on the side.
So Yumi has brought up that she is doing something very special called inner child healing, and Emma and I were like, wait, what is that? And we really want to do an episode on this. But Emma, also, is there anything in astrology that you're going to be talking about today regarding today's topic?
Yeah, so I know we just passed the Leo season, but a lot of what is considered inner child stuff happens with like Cancer and Leo energy. So it'll be really interesting, like once Yumi starts talking a little bit more about her own experience with this specific form of healing, how that plays into the astrology and if any of that like sticks out in her own chart or just in general. But yeah, we're going to take a, a trip back in time to like Cancer and Leo season once we start talking about the astrology.
Awesome. So Yumi, what exactly is inner child healing? Is exactly what the word is?
So inner child healing is about reconnecting and nourishing literally your inner child. So a lot of times, we kind of go back to unresolved issues you may have or traumas or pains, and you try to like nourish it and heal it versus like suppressing it. So that's kind of in broad what inner child healing is.
Wow, I'm kind of, I guess, very intrigued because I'm thinking like, why does our childhood affect our adulthood? Like, if that was 20 years ago, why would that one incident impact us now? Do you know anything like about this?
Yeah, well, I think, when you're a kid, you're going through a huge developmental period, right? So what you have, the way how you were treated, things you were told, the environment you grew up in plays a huge factor in how we act as an adult now, like your patterns, what triggers you. So it's all interconnected. And I think that's why recognizing your patterns too is so important in really helping you uncover a lot of that in your adult life.
Do you have like an example of this one inner child healing you did about an incident back when you were a child and how it connects to you now?
Yeah, I have a lot of examples. So one of that, when I started inner child healing, I remember when I was young, like it doesn't matter, like I would play around with kids all the time. It doesn't matter if it were my fault or not. I was always the one blamed for everything. Just also to give you guys some context, I didn't grow up with my parents, so I didn't really reunite with my parents until I was in high school. So I grew up with relatives and just sort of like, yeah, family members per se. So I remember growing up, I was always blamed all the time. Doesn't matter if it was another kid's fault or whatnot. So I think one incident was, some kid made a mess one time, and people assumed for some reason it was me, and everyone started blaming me out of the blue. So for a while, it wasn't like, I think I would say that carried with me, honestly, until even early college. I think I become it caused me to be a person who like self-sabotage a lot, because it was like my immediate kind of pattern, like, oh, it has to be me if something is not going right. And yeah, I would say that's something that I'm still working on with my therapist, but I'm really glad that I'm now recognizing that I have this pattern.
That's really nice. Wow, yeah. So, how long would you say that you have been working? I mean, I'm sure you can dig into all these different patterns that we have, right? When we talk about the inner child, but how long have you been working on like that specific pattern, for example?
Yeah. Oh, it's still a work in progress. I feel like it's really hard when it's so like intertwined, it's embedded in your head for so many years. I have been officially working with my therapist for a little under a year now. And when it first started off, I actually went to her just for like general therapy. But after a couple of sessions, she's like, I think a lot of what you're going through now really stems from your inner child when we were younger. So I think two main things we were working on, even though there's so many patterns. One, what I just mentioned, self-blame, self-sabotage. And also I struggle with like, for a while, I didn't think I deserved to be happy. I know it sounds really crazy, but I feel when I was younger, especially when you're living with other kids and whatnot, when their parents are around, you know, in the Asian culture, kids are like, you're like, people, adults are always comparing you to all the other kids around you. So I remember there were even incidents when I was making better grades than other kids that I was living with. They were actually punished because of that. So, so I started to develop, you know, this idea that, oh, if I succeed, if I'm doing well, it means people around me are suffering. So so for a while I was really suppressing, you know, this so-called happy emotion, and I was so scared to enjoy being happy, and being happy actually was a really, really uncomfortable feeling for me. And you know, honestly, it wasn't until finding my current therapist I realized, like, wow, that's why for the longest time, you know, every time when I experience happiness, especially for like a more endured period of time, I started to feel very uncomfortable.
It kind of sounds like a belief work that you hear a lot of with, you know, spiritual gurus. Like I've learned a lot that a lot of our beliefs today as an adult doesn't really come from me, right? It comes from your parents, what you've been conditioned, movies, government, honestly. So, for example, how do I define relationships based on what I saw from my parents or, you know, what I saw in the movies? So, yeah, I think it's really important to ask yourself today, is what you have in your head really from you or from conditioned since you were a child? I also want to ask you, Yumi, if it's not too personal, I know you talked about some like health issues as well. Do you think that stemmed from that childhood trauma or things that you experienced as a child, or is that kind of like separate?
Yeah, I would say, you know, I was diagnosed with panic attack disorder like around 2018, 2019. Um, and I would say I would say like suppressing. I always knew even when I was younger, like one day, you know, obviously when I was a kid, I didn't know what therapy was even about, but I had a gut feeling that I would need some sort of like professional help, you know. But at the same time, I think um for me, even though I noticed I was like definitely like a person who's more anxious than others, I sort of really just like let it kind of slide, and until it really creeped up to a point I couldn't really, couldn't really like just close the closet anymore. So because of that, I think my 2018 first episode with panic attack was definitely a wake up call. You know, and your body, like I think people don't realize mental health is so also interconnected with how you feel physically. So I definitely do think that, you know, a lot of my traumas from my past also cause a very like prominent physical reaction, and one of that was panic attack disorder, and people's symptoms could be very different. For me in particular, I it happened actually during my sleep. So I had insomnia for a very, very long time. And also it kind of caused me to have vision issues. So for almost, I would say 8 to 9 months, um, everything I was seeing was almost like through a filter, like a grayish, grainy filter. I didn't feel present. I was very dissociated. And yeah, and it's crazy that, you know, how your symptoms kind of possess, right? So
Wow. Wow.
Wow.
Wait, so was there anything that you did to heal that, literally physically, or was it more like mentally you had to heal, or both?
mm, mm, um I think it's a combination. Yeah. Um, when it first started, honestly, it was really hard even sharing it with people because, you know, for one, you know, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a therapist, so I had a hard time understanding what exactly I was going through. It wasn't until months in, I just started to share with a few of my close friends about it, because at first I wasn't sure it was like an actual vision thing or if it's actually related to, you know, panic attack. So I would say, the healing process is very long. It's a lot of try and error, to be honest. Like there wasn't like, oh, I know exactly, you know, what the solution of step one is, and it's going to be very different person to person. I think for me, I needed my alone time. I feel like sometimes you do need that extra alone time to process what you're going through, and then I slowly to open up to friends around me, and I do think that just being able to vocalize how you're feeling and echo that out, it was super helpful because it made me feel that, you know, what I was going through is something valid. It's very real. It wasn't just in my head. And that's when I, you know, had the courage to actually start. So I had a different therapist at the time. So I started going to therapy for the first time during 2018.
Oh, so, and your vision kind of started to slowly come back after that with therapy.
Yeah, but I would say, so my case is interesting. So I started, my panic attack disorder started in 2018. It got better actually towards the end of 2019, and then COVID hit. You know, so during my panic attack diagnosis in 2018, socializing was really, really, really hard for me because you just don't know when your episodes would happen. Sometimes it's very random. It could be, you know, I could be walking down the street, I could be in an Uber car. So I was so scared of going out and meeting people. So for a while, you know, I mean, obviously, so something most people don't know, because, you know, when you're just outside and whatnot, people don't assume that you have a lot going on, right? So, but that's why I feel like so I think for me, it took longer than expected because, you know, during COVID, during lockdown. So really in 2021, to me, was like a brand new life again, because I'm learning to, you know, I was able to see things more clearly for the first time, and I was going out without having to, you know, be super anxious that I would have another panic episode, because the first one, when it occurred, it was so bad where my roommate had to call an ambulance, and that was my very first panic attack in my life. Because of the severity of that, I was just like, you know, I just want to stay in. But I'm just really thankful that I'm able to be where I am now. Yeah.
Wow, that is a crazy story because I mean, when you said you can have panic attacks in your sleep, it's like so subconsciously, it's like it's so buried under there that this would happen when you're literally like body is shut down. That just sounds crazy to me. Wow.
Yeah, it was so, like, honestly, I just woke up middle of the night, and at first, you know, I thought maybe I'm having a heart attack, you know, because it was something so foreign for me. And then I had my roommate, I was like, I think I'm dying, like, please call the ambulance. And she called, and when they came, you know, they did a lot of like my vital checks and whatnot. And then they're like, you're actually okay, you don't have a heart attack, you probably had, you know, a panic attack. And that was the first time anyone has ever told me that I need to seek, you know, help.
Interesting. Did you struggle with, I mean, you might have already kind of alluded to this, but did you struggle with anxiety before that without panic attacks? I think you said you did, right? And then you thought it was manageable until it got to the point where clearly it wasn't manageable. Yes? Okay, I see. Understand.
I knew, but I was just kind of like playing it off, and it was one of those things that, oh, maybe, like, you know, maybe like with time things will get better, but no, it just really like escalated until a point where you lose control.
Yeah.
Wow. That kind of reminds me, today I saw this video where we say that when we get hurt physically, we put on a band-aid, but your brain is an organ just like everywhere else in your body, and we don't really like heal our brain or our mental and psychological health. So I think it's so important to just try to heal our brain as well, just like the rest of parts of our bodies.
Totally.
Yeah.
So I guess I want to ask Emma and I, and Yumi as well, is there any belief recently, just like how we just talked about the inner child healing, where you realize that, hey, like this belief I don't like anymore, I want to change it? I think I can relate to Yumi a lot, where so recently I have talked to Emma so much about this, about becoming my own leadership, because I think growing up Asian, like you're meant to stay very quiet, and you know, my parents never really fueled my dreams, and they've always shut it down. So I always grew up thinking like I can't be happy because I felt guilty. So I realized, hey, that belief comes from my background, my culture, and my parents, and I don't want to believe that anymore. And once I changed my mindset, it's so weird because a lot of these rules and laws and regulations were started by somebody else and not me. And once I decided to change the rules and regulations of my own life, like I started to notice changes. And it just feels so good to make up my own rules and my own beliefs and realize that everything that you've been conditioned since you were a child doesn't have to stay that way. So yeah, I just love this whole topic of inner child and just like being your own person and just changing who you truly are and not what your parents taught you.
No, definitely. Something that me and my therapist talk about a lot. It's the concept also unlearning too, because I think we've been fed so much information and most of the time they're not even correct, you know? So I think it's really about like one, I think also now, things that we held on to so tightly when we're younger no longer really serves us, and we're just carrying like a huge backpack, just like weighs us down on a daily basis. I think now as an adult, it's important to also take a look at your past, but from an objective lens, right? Like a clean slate, really. And I think I remember like when my first session with my therapist, she asked me to picture like the first thing I think of, like like my childhood image or whatnot, to picture it. I struggle so bad with, I was rejecting that image because I didn't like my baby Yumi at all. And it started off just like a still picture in my head of me, and I didn't even want to turn that into motion because I was so scared that it'll open another, like it would just like open a box of worms. So um and it wasn't until just working with my therapist, like, okay, like what are you actually really scared of, like why are you scared about these things that happened to you? You were a kid, you didn't make these decisions, everything is out of your control, like you shouldn't be the one being scared, so that, I mean, having conversations like that really helped me understand, like, what was I scared of this whole time, like, to be honest, like now I feel like it's a little silly because we were holding on to a lot of ideas, concepts, a lot of assumptions, but none of them were like it's true, like we so I think unlearning and what you just said, make your own rules now as an adult, so clearly who you are as a person and not letting other people define you. And I think what you're doing, Grace, is like super empowering because I feel like it takes a lot of inner work to get to that place.
And it's crazy because we view you, Yumi. Like, I had no
Mm-hmm.
idea you had this whole story. Everybody was
Mm-hmm.
shocked because when we asked you questions like, oh, what would you do if, like, somebody left you in your life? You're like, yeah, I forget about them so easily. And we were like, whoa,
Mm-hmm.
she's like so nonchalant. But then, I'm sure you had to work to get to that
Mm-hmm.
point, and you just never know what somebody's going through behind,
Mm-hmm.
you, just the way
Yeah.
we see it.
Well, yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about things like that because it's a big part of how I heal. So I think, sometimes we don't want to talk about things because we still feel ashamed or scared and still feeling afraid of judgment. But when you're able to come clean and share so openly and publicly, I think it really gives me a sense of empowerment. Like, I'm owning who I am. I'm owning my past. I'm owning, who I am, who the person I've become. So I think opportunity for us to, again, like to share, to vocalize freely has been one of my favorite, I would say, practices to help me, in my inner child healing journey. But it's also something that, if you were to meet me like a few years ago, I feel I was so different. I was struggling so much with even like just socializing with people. But now it's amazing to see myself with new friends, right? Because you guys are also seeing me through a fresh lens. And at the same time, it's also showcasing that like you're witnessing my growth because the new feedback I'm hearing is very different than the feedback I've gotten in the past. So it really means a lot, and I really appreciate that.
Wow. I guess that's just a little quick. How are you doing now with
How am I
everything?
doing
Panic.
now? Yeah. Um, I would say overall I'm doing great. I'm really happy that I think when I first started doing inner child healing, it was very painful because it's kind of meant to be a little uncomfortable, But I'm really glad that through the process, I learned so much about myself, like including my superpowers. Like, I'm actually a really resilient person, despite what I've gone through as a kid. I struggle when I was younger. I was actually abused when I was in elementary for like a couple of years. And the degree of abuse was very traumatizing too. And I'm really just glad that I have it in me to be able to push through, adversities like that. And now working through inner child therapy, for me, it's like I start to appreciate who I am, also appreciate the baby Yumi for all the things that she had to put up with. I think I feel a lot more whole as a person because I feel more complete, and it's like a cycle, right? And I want to like complete that. So
Wow, that's amazing, baby Yumi.
maybe you, yeah.
Wow. I wanted to add too, I think you make a really good point, right? Like so much of the time with psychology and stuff like this, inner child healing, there's also something called internal family systems parts work, which is very similar to like inner child healing. Very helpful, by the way, for anyone who might be interested in something like that. But it's funny how even with spirituality as well, there's this concept that like when you come home to yourself, like that's when you'll find wholeness, right? And you kind of just said something like that, where like now that you've dug deeper into who you really are and you've made peace with closing that gap between today's Yumi and then baby Yumi, it's like you yourself are getting to witness another aspect of your own identity, which is really fascinating. And because you've been able to like open up this door to, oh, let me actually look at baby Yumi and what baby Yumi went through, and let me not like shy away from this anymore, and let me not like avoid this anymore. Let me just look at it, let me face it, and get into the concept of mind that like who I am today can help nurture this person back to like a healthy spot, or help, you know, guide them in a new way. And like you said, it kind of, yeah, it brings this feeling of like, oh yeah, I actually do feel whole now, because you're not running from yourself anymore. You know, it's beautiful.
No, I couldn't agree more. No,
Yeah.
the whole concept coming home is so true, because now looking back, like all the traits I have now, you know, I had them when I was a kid, but I was rejecting my good qualities. You know, I've always been a resilient person. I've always, you know, have these amazing like traits, but people around me, there was so much noise around me that was almost like trying to cover all the good things about me up pretty much. So now I'm just like, okay, I'm owning, this is who I am. You know, I'm like, basically I feel it does feel more whole when you can feel fully allow yourself to feel you as a person without the distraction or feeling like you have to let other people's opinion get in front of, you know, yourself, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Emma, do you have any recent beliefs that you changed?
I have a similar pattern where when I was a kid, I grew up learning that my value and my worth was attached to like my achievements or how much I could sacrifice for another person. So how much of my unhappiness, how much would I have to give in terms of like say my own happiness, my own peace, in order for somebody else to be happy? So I kind of can relate to what you were saying, Yumi, about how you know, as you've climbed the ladder of success, there's a part of you that felt afraid to be happy, afraid to be successful, because in your eyes, you interpret that as, oh, somebody else has to suffer. And I have a similar belief with that, where I would always be overgiving. And usually it was in the form of like intangible things. So like my time, my energy, my like listening ear, whatever it is. It'd be a lot of this type of stuff, not having proper boundaries. And eventually it would burn me out, and I would feel resentful, and I'd feel like, yo, why am I always drained and tired and this and that? And eventually I started to realize like, oh, wow, you know, I have this really strong belief that if I want to be happy, like I have to sacrifice something for somebody else. Like there's no way that both of us could like be happy, you know, it always has to come from somewhere. And so, you know, actually having to look at that brought up a lot of shame, right? Because I'm like judging my own self for, oh, you know, why did you do that? Why didn't you say no? Come on, you're a grown adult. Like, why is this still happening? But once I kind of looked at that, I was like, oh yeah, you know, let me process that emotion, right? Like physically process that emotion, and then actually look at like what part of me was, you know, learning to do that. So I would say that in a nutshell is one of the things that's like kind of come up for me recently. It's been like a lifelong thing for me, and currently just with astrology, I'm in my Saturn return, and my Saturn return falls in the sign of Pisces, and one of the shadows of Pisces is like self-undoing and self-sacrifice, like how you give so much that it actually undoes who you are. So yeah, I just wanted to add that in for the astrology aspect. But
Yeah, and it's great that you have that inner dialogue with yourself about that too, because even during my therapy session, like I after like, you know, my therapist was kind of like analyzing my patterns and whatnot, I noticed that oftentimes I would like even unconsciously like become my abuser almost, right? I was literally duplicating everything that she did to me, because I was almost like, because I was so like used to it in a way, it was such a familiar feeling. It was very easy to kind of like circle back to, and that's why it's such a vicious cycle, because it just kind of repeats on autoplay. So when you like what you mentioned, Emma, like you're able to like catch yourself during times like that. Like, wait a minute, why am I doing something like this? Like, I think it's so important, like you mentioned, like even writing it down and whatnot, because recently I had a phone call with my mom, and I honestly, I'm still learning new things about my parents, just because we didn't reunite until I was so much older. So I always assume that my parents are like very disappointed in me for some reason. And because of that, if I don't, like, let's say if my parents have a request, if I don't fulfill it and whatnot, I would always be like, oh, are you guys upset? Like, did I do something wrong? And then, like, recently I was on the phone with my mom about something. She had asked me to help her something. I tried, it didn't work out, and she was totally fine. She's actually a really chill person, but I was so worried, and I was like anxious, and I was like unhappy myself all day. I was like, what is it? Like, even my mom is fine. Like, why am I not happy? And I noticed, like, in the past, like, my abuser will often put me in settings where, to purposely generate a lot of self-blame for me. And I think that, and I took a moment, I remember I was like, I basically made a note of that feeling, and I wrote everything out, and I did like a little self-assessment, and that was really helpful, because it's so important too, because so much what you're going through sometimes is so only it's a very isolating feeling. But when you're able to project into something more tangible, whether it's through drawing, writing, whatever that may be for you, I think that really helps bring things to light.
Yeah.
Wow.
Absolutely. Also, I wanted to say,
no, go ahead.
no, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, like, I think the way that you articulated that also really shows us a lot about what we're hearing in regards to like generational trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you just said, right? There were times where I would assume the same behaviors as the perpetrator because that's what you grew up seeing. And this is like, this is such a good point, right? I don't know. I just think this is really important to talk about because it's such a hot topic, right? If you, for example, if you grow up seeing like your parents handle conflict through arguing and like violence and aggression, then it is very likely, not all the time, but it's a very likely that you could also grow up to be somebody who learns to solve conflict in like an aggressive type of way. And it's so funny because I noticed like with taking my own clients, but also in my own life, in my friends' life, and just observing people, it's very common for people to say like, oh, I'm nothing like my parents. Like I'm nothing like my mom. Like she's so this way and I'm not that way at all. And it's very true that like a lot of times that might be true where there's a part of them that is not say aggressive or they're more of like a people pleaser or something, but then in certain moments where like they get triggered, this really aggressive side of them like comes out, which is very similar to their mother. And so the ability to like actually look at that and see it and be like, oh shit, like that is the same pattern, right? That now I am reenacting because I watched it in my childhood, and thus, right, if I don't become aware of that and then learn to manage it, that becomes something that your children will watch happen, right? And this is how generational trauma and patterns are perpetuated like over and over and over again. So I just wanted to add that because I think it's super important and like a perfect example of that.
No, 100%, especially going back to generational trauma too. One thing me and my therapist talked about, and was also motivation for me, because I think in the future, if I want to have like, family, whatnot, like they are going to be imitating off of my patterns, So I think keeping that in mind, like, how you're feeling and what you're echoing will affect so many people also around you, even right now, immediately. So understanding that, we're like, wow, the impact that you can have and the importance of recognizing, things like that, because often how you feel about yourself, you also echo that out to people around you. And no, you made such a good point. That's something that me and my therapist talk about all the time. It's also motivation for me, knowing that, wow, like how I feel, has this like immediate impact, but also when you have kids, that's like a direct, they're going to be a duplication of you in some sort of way.
Yeah. Wow. Beautiful.
I read this book, you guys. It's called It Didn't Start With You, or something like that. And it was saying that generation trauma, or even the good parts, actually passed down 2 generations, because technically you were there when your mom was in your grandmother's belly. Like your egg is inside your mom's when she was a fetus. So that trauma from your grandma and from her trauma from her mother and stuff like that just like goes down at least 2 generations. So a lot of the things that we're experiencing and we have about, our own problems don't come from us. But it also reminds me of the movie Ends With Us, is that you don't have to let it pass down anymore. That you can end it yourself right here and don't pass it down to yourself and to your kids. So we have the power to change that, which is, I think, also cool at the same time.
Yeah, no, super cool. Also, like the idea of like reinterpreting, what you went through too. I think also sometimes when you share your story, the society has its own interpretation to what you have gone through. And I think for a while, to be honest, I didn't really feel the need to do therapy was because like I never had like this anger or resentment towards my childhood abuser and whatnot. So because of that, I was like, oh, I assume everything was okay. But then I totally forgot the other half, of me, how I was feeling, how baby Million was feeling on the inside. So I was like, oh, I'm not angry at her, then I think I should be fine. But I think what I was trying to say that I think as adult me now reinterpreting what I went through, I think one of the reasons I never had resentment towards her because truth be told, like everyone's story is like very different. But I think for me, I learned to not. I never really had like a complete shameful view of what happened to me. It was always something like, oh, like I always have seen it in a slightly different light. I feel like it really shaped me also into who I am today. I think I was able to draw like other aspects out of it versus I feel like when I was younger, when I was sharing my story with others, they immediately have a lot of association about what I've gone through. And I was starting to associate, I was like, oh, I should be feeling this way. I should be feeling angry and whatnot, right? So I think also allowing yourself to be able to again, going back to what Grace was saying too, having your own ideologies, your own rules on how you want to interpret your past.
Mm-hmm.
What do you guys think about forgiveness? For example, Yumi, do you think you have to forgive your abuser, and Emma with, whoever you had to forgive when you guys had trauma?
I think like in a certain sense, when you forgive your abuser, you're also forgiving yourself, because when you're so like hold on to it, there's also an element of self-blame, self-satisfied, because I was like, oh, I didn't do X and X for myself. How come I didn't like stand up for myself when I was younger? I could have done better X and X. But all of that, to be honest, like at this point, obviously that all had happened already. So I think letting forgive that doesn't mean that whatever happened to you didn't happen. It's more so that like you're sort of like letting go of things that no longer serve you in a way, without you're always going to remember it, but how you feel, how you react to it it's fully in your control.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully said. I was actually going to say pretty much the same exact thing. I think the one thing I've learned about forgiveness is that a lot of times when we're out here saying, oh, I need to forgive this person, it's really yourself that you're looking to forgive, because saying and pushing that off to somebody else is another way that we avoid taking responsibility for our own involvement, even if it wasn't really our own conscious involvement of a situation. So for example, I've been in a few relationships that didn't really go so well, if you will. And, I was hurt by the person that I was with. And so there was an element of like, oh, I need to forgive this person for like what they did to me, and then this will be fine. But then you kind of realize that, like what Yumi said, that some of it is also my own shit. It's my own, like, oh, why did I allow myself to stay in this relationship? When things started to look a certain way, why didn't I just get up and leave? Or like, why didn't I hold myself to a higher standard? All this self-blame language. But I do think that it's also important to like, I don't want to say quote unquote learn the lesson, but whatever it is that you can learn from that experience, I think is worth taking. It's worth learning something, right? So like Yumi said, sure, I might not forget the way that these people treated me, right? And I might not want to have to think about it a lot, but I can learn something now moving forward in my relationships. Okay, like what were certain like red flags that maybe I overlooked at the time? Or if I felt a certain way and I decided to not honor it, let me do better next time when I meet somebody. If I get that weird feeling in my gut, for example, don't just glaze over it and pretend like, oh, this will be fine. Well, maybe it won't be fine, So yeah, I would say that that's important. It's really common for people nowadays to say that forgiveness, right, is for yourself. It's not for another person. And I think, Grace, we talked about this the other day. There's like a quote that says something about how resentment and therefore like a block to forgiveness is like, it's like drinking poison and expecting and hoping that somebody else will get hurt, which is true, because when you hold on to this this anger, this resentment, or this pain, or whatever it is, and you're willing to forgive somebody else but not yourself, then you still hold that. You still hold all those emotions. So I don't know. I think it's interesting, but I would agree with what Yumi said for sure.
Yeah, yeah. I think when I was doing that deep meditation about forgiving somebody that hurt me, it also brought me to, well, who is Grace in front of forgiveness? Who is Grace going through hard times and good times? And I love how my favorite spiritual guru right now, Bashar, he says that when you jump into the unknown, the only thing you'll find is more aspects of yourself. There's
Yes.
nothing out there that's going to scare you or surprise you. It's just you in different scenarios. So if you think about it that way, it's less scary to go through anything in life.
Yeah.
I guess, Emma, I want to ask you, is there anything in our charts in astrology that predicts or anything about childhood? Like, is there somebody who goes through tougher childhood and it's in our stars?
So, yes, I want to say yes and also no. There can be people who go through really extreme things in their childhood, but if you look at their natal chart, it might not necessarily look at first glance like, oh, they've been through a ton of stuff. And then there are other people who I'll look at their charts and it does signify, oh, wow, like the fourth house, for example, is the house of home and family. They have all these malefic planets like Pluto and Mars, like which is conflict and then trauma and stuff in the fourth house, which could suggest, oh shit, this person really went through it, when they were a kid. But then you'll talk to them and they're like, no, I had a great upbringing. Like my family was fantastic, whatever. Because you have to remember there's also an empowered expression of those planets, right? So somebody who has Pluto and Mars in the fourth house, sure, it could indicate a childhood that was rife with trauma and manipulation and conflict and aggression or violence, but it could also represent a childhood with really assertive parents, people who were pioneers and trailblazers and not afraid to be themselves and to push that out into the world, not apologizing for who they are, and parents who taught you how to properly grieve. For example, maybe you've experienced a lot of grief, but your parents were very good at learning how to navigate that or teach that to you. So that's one thing just right off rip that like kind of is important when it comes to that. But yeah, I would say the fourth house is where you can see a lot about your childhood and how you grew up and the type of influences that were a part of your home and family environment. And then the fifth house, which is right after that, is the house of entertainment, fun, youth, and children. It's the inner child. So just there's a lot to say about that, but if we're talking about the inner child, if you look at your natal chart, look for where you see Leo. It'll be covering like one of your houses. I know for Grace, I think yours is your midheaven is in Leo. I can't remember if you have a ninth house or ninth or 10th house in midheaven, but it's either your ninth or 10th house that's in Leo. Mine's in the fifth house. And Yumi, I'm not sure where yours is, but I can look. And you can find that when you come with the energy of the inner child, it's very youthful, playful, creative, self-validating energy to that area of your life, that area of your life will improve. And then you can also look at it the other way where whatever house it is, when you embody the inner child energy in that house, you just help like your own inner child, if that makes sense. So just to give an example, mine is the fifth house, which is about creativity. And I find that when I connect to my own creative pursuits and I just create something to create it, not for the goal of it having to be perfect or having to reach a certain outcome, I feel very connected to my inner child, like very connected. So that would be kind of how you translate that if you were to look at like your own chart.
Amazing. And also, we give our guests a little bit of like a mini astrology motivational, message to take home with you. And I know you don't know exactly your time, but you told us you were a Sagittarius, Leo rising, and Virgo moon. Emma, do you have any messages for Yumi?
Yeah, so I just think it's really interesting that this whole episode you're sharing about your experience with panic attack disorder, because with a moon in Virgo is one of the signs that can struggle a lot with anxiety, which is oftentimes like what connects panic disorder right to your health. So they can struggle a lot with anxiety and have a lot of like racing thoughts. There can also be some type of like, I don't want to say addiction, but like addiction to like self-blame and like self-sabotage, like looking at things through the lens of like, this is always my fault. Or even if people are telling you it's not your fault, there's that voice in the back of your head that's like, yes, it is. Yes, it is. This is all you. So a lot of that, because it's the moon for you in Virgo, is an unconscious thing. Like it might be something that you don't really recognize until, like you said, a certain point where now your actual life is being affected and you're like, oh man, so I got to get control of this thing. So I wanted to, if anything, just validate for you, not that you need it, but still just validate how awesome it is to see somebody navigating that placement in like the real world. Like, what does that actually look like in terms of how you live your life? Because some people in astrology will say that having a moon in Virgo is kind of a difficult placement because the moon is all about emotion and feeling and not being in your head. And Virgo like lives in its head and it's running rampant with anxiety. So good on you really for that one. Like, you know, to be willing to face those patterns and actually learn what you need to learn to like combat I don't want to say negatives of it, but combat the things that become disempowering. Sagittarius and Leo are both fire signs, and they are all about like unapologetically like sharing your energy and your vitality with the world. I obviously just talked about the fifth house, which is naturally ruled by Leo. So you have a Leo rising. So it sort of makes sense actually that inner child healing might be interesting to you because there is a very childlike part of you, very playful, creative, likes to have fun, likes to be entertained and to entertain as your rising sign. That's how you learn to navigate the world. So it's just really perfect. When I saw your astrology, I was like, oh wow, it makes a lot of sense that like you would get into inner child healing. And I didn't know about the panic disorder aspect, but I was curious to see what you were going to focus on. And it just is crazy to me that it ties directly in with the Virgo and the anxiety. I mean, I could go on forever, but Sagittarius is the archetype of the teacher. It's the eternal student, and it's great at transmuting knowledge into wisdom, and it's known to broadcast what it learns. So you being here and sharing this, I would totally say is an empowering thing, obviously for you, but even for other people watching, because what you're doing is you're showcasing to everybody that when you we can live a lot of our lives dictated by how we've learned to be, by our conditioning, right? And to look outside of ourselves and feel like everything is out of control and I don't know what to do about it. But by looking inward, by having the courage to look inward at your own patterns, you find your inner power, right? And then you become somebody who walks into spaces and goes out into the world and impacts your environment instead of being swallowed whole by your environment, you know? And I think that's an important lesson for anybody to learn. So thank you for sharing everything. It's been great having you.
Well, no, I do want to leave also with like a note too. I really appreciate you guys so much for having me, because one of my goals this year working with my therapist was to be able to share more about inner child healing with people who are interested. And I know sometimes people hear inner child healing a lot, but also people don't really sort of understand like the process, and because there's so many nuance to it, especially everyone's journey is so personalized. And I was mentioning to my therapist that I want to find more, just connect with more people who are interested in this topic, because I hope people who hears this, who are looking to seek inner child healing, I feel like this could be a sign for them, if they are curious in exploring that sort of their healing journey. So thank you for the opportunity. And I'm just, I feel like every time I have conversations like that, it just really, how should I put it? It just really like, it just like really like touches me on the inside, because I can't imagine myself being able to do this a few years ago, and now I'm being able to share so openly and with people that that I adored. It's just been a lot of fun. So thank you.
Yeah.
Go
Yay.
Yume!
Go Yume! Amazing. Amazing.
Well, thank you everyone for joining, and you guys can go check out Yume's social media down below. Thank you, Yume, and thank you guys for watching. See you guys in our next episode.
Bye.